Due to lack of affordable housing and shelters in Barrie, homeless people are forced to live in public parks. However, the city has issued large fines to them. There are many non-profit organizations in Barrie helping people facing homelessness, mental health, and addiction issues. One of them is the Gilbert Centre. I talked to their harm reduction manager, Sarah Tilley. Thank you, Sarah, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I wanted to start about the recent. So the homelessness problem has been there for a long time. Uh, Specifically after the pandemic, when housing prices went up very sharply. Though the housing prices have cooled down in recent months, but we also know the job market has also cooled down. The inflation has gone up, so people are still struggling with the housing and the living situation, putting food on table every day. And recently, this is the summer, so we have seen the people who have been living in shelter, or maybe staying on bus stops at night. They have come out, and some of them are camping at different locations in Barrie. And recently, uh, a woman named Ash Wolf, she received a ticket for $360 because she has been living in at Milligan's, near Milligan's Pond. And I talked to her. On Friday, and I understand that you can't talk about these specific issues, specific person that you have been working with. But when I talked to her, one of the organizations she mentioned was Gilbert Centre, that she's working with you, and she's getting help that she mentioned. But I wanted to talk in general about the issue of homelessness in Barrie that has come to light specifically due to this incident. So what have been your experience and knowledge about this crisis in Barrie?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to recognize that although the housing market is stabilizing a little bit, it's still at considerably higher rates than it has been for a really long time. And for folks who are on any sort of social assistance, whether that be Ontario Works, Ontario Disability Support Program, Canadian pension plans, anything like that, the amount of rent often supersedes the amount that people are getting for financial support. And so that's extremely problematic, especially when we don't have enough like geared to income housing or rent subsidies that can help people with some of those costs. Even with rent subsidies, for example, if somebody's getting $600 to $800 to pay for housing in addition to the $400 that they would get from Ontario Works. Oftentimes that's like maybe $1,000, and that's somebody's entire monthly income. And most rent right now for even a bachelor, one bedroom, is $1,200 plus utilities and more. And that's if landlords and the people renting these units are willing to take on somebody who isn't able to demonstrate that they have a full-time job, when the amount of available and financially affordable units are considerably lower than the amount of people who maybe are working full-time and still needing housing. Then it makes it really, really difficult for people who are often shut out of those markets because they don't have good credit, because they don't have, an employment history that a landlord can look at and view as stable, whether or not it is. so it makes it even more difficult. So while things are stabilizing in terms of not continuing to go up, it's still extremely expensive. $2,000 to $3,000 to house a family is, even if you're working full time, for a lot of people that's just unaccessible. And so people who have never experienced homelessness and maybe are experiencing poverty because it's difficult to make ends meet, like you were saying, it's difficult to, living paycheck to paycheck. One missed work of week can mean that somebody is now not able to provide housing for them. If they have a family, if you lose accommodations, if you're living in a shelter, unless you're able to get into a family shelter, or if you're living, say, in a park or in a camper, something like that, that can be grounds to have your children taken away. Not having a residence can impact your employability. And then somebody who was, I say normal very loosely, but in a normal situation, because of our current economy and because of the housing market, it can throw people into extreme depths of poverty who maybe didn't have some of the other issues that we normally see as accompanying people who are experiencing homelessness. Not that it's always true, but, like really extreme experiences of trauma or mental health issues or addiction issues. People aren't coming to homelessness with those experiences. However, the longer that people are experiencing homelessness, the longer people don't have the ability to create safety, the more likely they are to experience poor mental health or negative mental health impacts. And the more likely they are to start using drugs as a way of either coping or surviving, really. If I need to be up if I need to be up for 20 hours a day to make sure that my stuff is not getting stolen or that I'm not being assaulted, those kind of things, it's eventually going to wear on my body's natural ability to do that. And I'll need some sort of, something perkier than coffee to help me get that energy. And so I don't think it's often talked about enough that using drugs can truly be a survival mechanism for a lot of people who are living on this street, and that it's not an easy, someone had mental health issues and therefore they're homeless, without recognizing that experiencing homelessness is extremely traumatic, and that comes with its own stuff. So sorry to derail, but that's the climate. I mean, we've always had people who are living rough, or people who are not able to stay in shelter, who are not able to stay with friends, but are staying outside, whether that is, on a park bench, and maybe they just move around when security's not there, or people who maybe have the ability to get a tent and stay in a little bit more secure, hidden away area. We have had people living rough in Barrie for many, many, many years. I mean, since I was a teenager, I know firsthand that there have been people who are experiencing that. However, with the pandemic, and I think just how much information gets shared on social media, how quickly it is to bring an issue to light. I think more people, more people are experiencing that homelessness, so it's more visible. And once something becomes visible, it gets shared by everybody, and it becomes a really visible focal point. So I think those are some of the things that we're seeing with the current housing issue and the current experiences of homelessness. When things become more visible, you're going to have people on both sides of the fence, people who want to do things to support, and people who maybe don't understand homelessness or see homelessness as a personal failing, who might have more negative things to say about people, or who might make more complaints, for example, which just more eyes on people, right? The more eyes that are on people, the more the more the community is going to talk about it, and that's going to be it's going to be a very mixed bag. And the more people complain, then the more that institutions like city bylaw or the police, the more that they're going to hear about it and the more they're going to get involved. And I think that's something that in the last few years has maybe changed how homelessness looks in Barrie. Not that the circumstances have changed dramatically, not that this is not the first even 4 years that people have been sleeping in parks and tents, but there's a lot more scrutiny around it right now.
Yeah, and you raised very, very interesting points in your explanation, and I just wanted to get back to a few of them. Is first thing you mentioned about when I first moved from Mississauga to Barrie, the house I saw, the first one, is right next to the Milligan Pond, that park, right? That wall to wall, and I saw that that apartment. And when I went, the person told the owner told me that at least 50 to 60 people came in to see that house, and he received so many applications at that time. Had a full-time job, and everything in place, but I did not get that house. So it just so. And even I was talking to Ash when I was speaking to her that this is the problem that I faced as having a full-time job. So that's and this is even I did not understand this issue, because before this I was living in the US, and at that time the housing crisis even in the US was not as bad. And when I came to Canada, I realized this problem is much more worse in Canada, and that become even a lot more worse because of the pandemic. And other issue you mentioned was, and the same thing Ashley mentioned to me that since she received the ticket on July 4th, police have been coming in and going out. There have been vans and attempt to evacuate. So she has been not going out even to buy food. And she has been staying put at her place all the time. She said she couldn't even go out at her friend's place where she was going to take a shower. So I could see that is taking toll on her personally. And then, as you said, I'm not talking now specifically about her, but other people, that homelessness became mental issue, and then that could lead to addiction, and people think they are addicted. That's why, because they are homeless, but that many times it's the other way around, that you lose a job, and then just you kicked out of the apartment, and then that spirals. And she also talked about her having 3 children and not able to see them. So there are just a snowball effect of all this crisis. And some of the issues I wanted to now get back to. One of the things she mentioned about the constant surveillance and harassment by the police. So in your experience or experience of your organization, so what kind of issue you see when there is the involvement of the police? Because many times people say there should be intervention from people who can have expertise in addressing the homelessness, or people who have the addressing the mental issue problem, rather than city should be sending them, rather than sending the police big vans and those gears that just frighten them and escalate the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I again can't speak to anything specifically. I think that it's really complicated in that most I don't think it's a surprise that most social service agencies have limited resources and are often funding is maybe 1 to 2 to 3 years given at a time. And so to build up really sustainable programming that can, get out and address all of the issues can be really difficult in the not-for-profit sector in general. And so what happens in turn is that the organizations or the institutions that are more stable, so for example, the police, city bylaw, those kind of things, they end up taking on some of that work because they're the only ones that are able to sustainably have the funding and the resources to do it. They also have, so I think in terms of like, if you're looking at a complaints basis, right? If you're looking at part of the community is saying, for example, they don't feel safe. I think there's a huge misunderstanding when it comes to what safety looks like. I think that homelessness can make us feel really, really uncomfortable. And seeing the visible evidence of people living in poverty and really dire circumstances, essentially letting us know that we failed as a community to take care of everybody can make us feel really uncomfortable, and that can be misunderstood sometimes maybe as a lack of safety. And so, however, if somebody is feeling unsafe, again, uncomfortable, and they tell the police that this person has made them feel unsafe, the police don't necessarily know, or the city doesn't necessarily know if, where that's coming from. And one of their concerns is around making sure that some folks feel safe. Right. And so there's a balancing act that can get really, really complicated, especially when people who are experiencing homelessness maybe don't present in what we consider to be like a respectable way. And so maybe aren't listened to as much when it comes to that back and forth, who said what. And so that can get really complicated for city to try and determine, and kind of falls into this legal area, right? And so that's where the police come in, and the police really are the only body that we have to enforce things. And that's the power that they have. Mm-hmm. So if the city is concerned, they're concerned from their perspective about safety, whether or not there's a true issue regarding safety. And somebody is not, in this case, not able to comply because there really just isn't anywhere else for them to go, then the next step is to enforce that compliance. And that's where the police are involved. And I think, I don't think I need to go in that doesn't necessarily mean that people are having their needs addressed. It means that they're dealing with a conflict in one way, and the goal is to stop whatever it is that's happening from happening. And if somebody moves on to another area, then that person isn't going to be making the same complaint, and they're going to say that they feel safer. Doesn't mean that the community is safer, doesn't mean that the issue has gone away, but it means that people won't necessarily be calling in as much to say that they don't feel safe. And so then if we were to look at statistics and that kind of stuff, we could say, well, we have less complaints now. Less complaints means more safety in community. And it looks like we're creating safety, but in reality, what we're doing is we're pushing people to shadows where they won't be seen, so that people aren't making complaints, but we're not addressing the issue. And what's really difficult and what's really damaging about that is that if we push people to the shadows and we make it so that they can't engage the police if they're having issues. So say I'm experiencing homelessness and I'm living in an encampment, and I've already had a complaint made against me about a neighbor, and then they come and they do something, maybe they assault me. I'm not going to call the police, because the police, like, from my perspective, I think that the police already believe this person, which then puts me in danger at potentially more assault. And so if I move away to the shadows and I'm not calling the police, then the next time that assault could be worse because nobody's around to see it. And because they don't feel like there's any sort of mechanism or recourse to be able to have my assault addressed, because whether true or not, I'm going to feel like the police in the city only care about the safety of other people and not my own safety. And so in addition to the very real consequences of not being able to call the cops, not having that legal recourse, it's also potentially going to really impact my own feelings of whether or not I'm valuable, of whether or not I should be allowed to be in community. It can increase my own feeling, like we all have feelings of shame. So it can compound those feelings of shame, which can negatively impact our health, our physical health, our mental health. It can maybe push us into more destructive coping mechanisms, those kinds of things, because we don't feel like we're valuable and we don't feel like the community sees us as valuable. And so it can be, even from that perspective, really difficult to try and do, I'm saying these things in quotations because they would take a lot more time to really roll out, but to be quote unquote productive members of society, that's really difficult when you don't feel like you're a worthy human being. And so there's a whole lot of layers to it that really complicate the issue. However, if we're not providing people with their basic needs, then we're not ever going to get to a point where we can actually ensure safety for all of our community. And that will include the people who don't feel safe walking through parks. And it will also include the people who are having to live in those parks, as well as has already been mentioned, the families that when people are experiencing homelessness, it disrupts families. And so then those families grow up feeling like all of the people in there feel unsafe, and it can create a lot of really negative and harmful cycles that really just don't work to help community at all, but throw us into more of those problematic experiences, if that makes sense.
And interesting that you talked about the safety. And when I went at the park near Milligan's Pond, and to be honest, as a non-white person, I'm because when I go out to cover any event, so I don't come across as a reporter or as a journalist, because that's not what you see in Barrie. And I experienced that at a few events I went to cover. So when I first I was going there, and I was kind of little hesitant at, but when I went there, they asked me, there were around maybe 10 to 12 people were there. Some of them were homeless and some of them were former homeless people, and then they were just chatting. And when I went there, they asked me whether I was from Ryan Soap or Gilbert Centre or some organization. So when they saw me, they saw me as somebody who went there to help them. And that I was that was kind of emotional for me. The first reaction I received for them, and when I told them that I was from the media, and it they told me that they do not want to be seen on the camera, but they were ready to talk to me. And they asked me where from my accent, where I was from. And they were so that was very different experience even for me. And I realized that and when I talked to them, when I went inside her encampment, when she invited me, and when she showed me around, so that gave me very different feeling that it's these people they just want to they are care about more about their own safety, and they are not actively, or even that I don't think even there is that back up their mind that they want to harm somebody, that they are more concerned about their safety from the police or even from the people, because as you mentioned that, if a homeless person who is, living in a park, if they go to police for complaint, police are not going to, hear their complaint, because they are in the wrong according to the law. So I think that's maybe, I think that's a lot comes from the lack of education among people about, what homeless people are, just because, as you said, they are not well dressed, or doesn't look like the way we everybody else is. So they take them as a threat, rather than somebody, who could we could talk to, or help in, any way. And another problem I see, I don't know if it's applicable and you can tell, but I think also that, see, from the view of the colonization, that, and I see this, people say, oh, this is not a third world country, that people can live in the park. And this is, and I hear that a lot, coming from India, that, this is fine in India, that people can live in the park, they can live on the sidewalk. But this is Canada, like, these people are not poor, everybody can get a job here, there are opportunities, there are enough jobs, you can make money. And even if you are living in a park, or you are homeless, or you're unemployed, that's your choice. And that's just, get up and then go to the Walmart, and then you can get a job. So I see that, that problem a lot. And this is what I'm hoping, talking to you, that people will see the other side of the story too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. So I have worked with police in a variety of circumstances, and I'm not sure that police wouldn't necessarily go out to, and they have, like, if people are in encampments and there's an assault, police maybe will attend. But for the person who's, I won't say maybe will attend, if they have the resources, they'll attend because it's a call that they're getting. However, if somebody's living in a park and they're worried about getting evicted, they're not going to call the cops. And even if they do, they have to weigh out the safety of what that immediate situation is versus what are the long-term consequences of knowing, like, having the police know that I'm staying here. And so that's where it gets really, really messy. And then in terms of, colonization is so much to say on that. At first, I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of the folks who are experiencing homelessness and experience the most extreme forms of poverty, and who are experiencing issues with poor mental health or those kind of things, addiction, etc., there is a huge connection to Indigenous genocide that we really can't ignore. A good chunk of the people who are experiencing homelessness have some sort of indigeneity. And so in such a, Barrie is very diverse, and the diversity is growing. For a very long time, Barrie has been quite conservative and very visibly white. And so for such a white area, for there to be such a high proportion of people who are Indigenous who are experiencing homelessness, I think it's really important to recognize that maybe that's coming from, like, systemic issues, systemic inequality, how people are treated, access to healthcare, those kind of things, access to child, oh my goodness, advocacy, no, CIS, I cannot, connections, child protective services, and how certain communities, certain groups, certain families are more likely to have interactions with those systems than others, and how that's rooted in really historic but continuing experiences of racism and cultural genocide that it's really, I think, easy to and we should be looking at what's happening with the residential schools and the uncovering of the atrocities that have happened and the amount of children in marked and unmarked graves. The amount of the death rates were astronomically disturbing, regardless of whether or not they were accounted for or not. But the amount of unmarked graves, I think it's really important to recognize that not all the children that went to those schools perished in those schools, and they grew up with those legacies of extreme trauma and genocide, and how that is really impacting people's abilities to create safety in community, and how we see that in extreme experiences of poverty and homelessness. That is not to say that homelessness and poverty is specifically born out of that level of trauma, or that it's an Indigenous issue. By no means. There's extreme resiliency that should never have had to happen, but did happen, that we see all the time. But it's really important to not lose sight of the fact that poverty is a structural and systemic issue. And when we have a very blatant historical case of cultural genocide, that we can't ignore that those two things are related. And if we're going to really address truth and reconciliation, then we need to reconcile with how we treat people who are experiencing homelessness and people who are experiencing poverty, and make sure that there are true opportunities and true resources, real resources that people can access to participate in community and to create safety in community that has been afforded to other people just by the virtue of their history and their skin, that's not afforded to everybody.
Yeah, and just last couple of things I wanted to talk about is, you mentioned about the colonization and Barrie, until recently being predominantly a white community. And in one of the podcasts, the co-founder of Barrie Native Friendship Center, Ernestine Baldwin, she mentioned when she moved to Barrie in maybe 70s, maybe she was the only Indigenous person in the area. And as we know the history of Barrie, that many Indigenous persons were removed from Lake Simcoe, near Lake Simcoe in Barrie, and they moved to reserves. So that aspect is still there, and hopefully people will learn more about that and try to understand the connection of homelessness and other issues with the colonization. But one of the things I wanted to ask about is in light of what kind of resources or help your organization particularly provide to people facing homelessness or other issues.
Yeah, so I work for the Gilbert Centre, and we're an aid service organization. So we were born out of gay and LGBTQ rights, like fights for advocacy and fights for rights, and the need to come together as community to support people who are grieving around HIV and AIDS epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s. And so the reason I bring that up is a big part of our organization is really supporting and amplifying the voices of the communities and the people who are impacted by the issues that we are trying to address. There's a prominent saying, "Nothing about us without us," and that's true of our kind of organization as well. And so we can we can try to offer a variety of supports, which can include getting people connected to referrals. A few years ago, that meant connecting people to housing workers because we were still having issues, but there was a supply of housing. Now we have housing workers, but we don't have those supplies of housing. So we still attempt to do those things, but it might be more around trying to find those alternative accommodations. It might be around supporting people to know their legal rights when it comes to those sorts of situations, helping people with eviction support. Not that we do that work, but we can connect people and provide referrals to those things. When it comes to encampments and evictions, like encampment evictions, that's a little bit more complicated because it's not the landlord tenant board that has to do with that, because there's no landlord to provide tenancy, right? It gets a little bit more complicated when it's property that's owned by the city. So it comes down to municipal law, it comes down to provincial law and federal law, depending on what's going on, what the complaints are about. However, from an international human rights perspective, housing is a human right, and Canada has signed on to declarations that have stated as such. So from a very high level, if somebody doesn't have access, if there are no available resources, if there's no available housing, then people have the right to create that for themselves. However, what that looks like on the actual, like boots on the ground, what that really looks like in practice, it gets really complicated, and we don't have a federal, we don't have any sort of Supreme Court rulings that can tell municipalities and provinces what it is that they have to do. So we can help support people in getting connected to the agencies and the organizations who know more about that, who might be able to support, an eviction, because an eviction is an eviction is an eviction. To be able to look at what some of that recourse is. It by no means means that we could, stop people from getting kicked out of encampments. It does not mean that we can stop people from being arrested. Not that that's happened. In my understanding, we haven't had an arrest for an eviction like we have seen in, Toronto or BC or even Nova Scotia. They've had some pretty visible and violent evictions within encampments. We haven't seen that in Barrie, and hopefully we won't. But if the only recourse that is left is to physically remove a person for something like trespassing, that is always a possibility that the city and the police can use. And so we can help people to understand what that process is, again, not that we know what it's going to look like in practice, but we can tell people what those laws are, and we can help people if they're looking to maybe get some more support around that. As an organization, kind of more practical stuff that we do, that seems a little like airy-fairy sometimes. We have a food shelf to non-perishable food items that often come from donation that we can provide to community. We do harm reduction. So we are really focused on making sure that people who are using drugs are doing it in a way that's safe for them and for the folks around them. So we're able to provide unused equipment to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted and bloodborne infection. We can do things like if somebody sees an area, maybe there was an encampment, for example, in a park, and a family sees that there's a whole bunch of needles and stuff. Maybe there was a bin, it got broken open, who knows? But there's a whole bunch of, litter and debris. We can come in and do a clean of the area and pick up those items, that kind of thing. We can also, when we have it, we get clothing and camping items donated, so we can provide those to community as needed, as well as for people who are maybe, for the lucky few who are able to get into housing, we also get donations of things like bedding and plates, cups, cutlery, like that kind of stuff to help people who are maybe moving on to a different chapter where they're able to be housed. So we do a bunch of that,
Yeah.
and we also work with folks who are using drugs to a whole bunch of things, but essentially to promote education around, those health things, but also people who use drugs are very, very rarely consulted when it comes to creating programming for people who are using drugs. And so we try and facilitate some of those conversations and get some of that information so that we can provide it to community when we're looking at things like the SCS that hopefully we'll be getting in the next couple of years. That kind of thing, like just how we can make services meaningful so that people are using it and that they do have the intended benefit, rather because the information is coming from people who are going to be using the service, rather than, I can have all sorts of ideas about what pilots need. I'm not a pilot. And those ideas are just ideas. If, I put together a program and it fails because no pilots come, that doesn't necessarily mean that pilots don't need anything. It's that I maybe didn't get all my information. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that when it comes to services for people who are using drugs as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So thank you so much for the work you do. And thank you, Sarah, for your time again. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Yeah.